On a frozen winter morning in the Oostvaardersplassen, a nature reserve on a polder that sits roughly 3 meters below sea level east of Amsterdam, a Konig pony stands knee-deep in iced reedland, where, within living memory, there was only the floor of the Zuiderzee. This drained stretch of former sea, finished in 1968 and originally zoned for factories, became, by the late 1990s, one of the densest large-herbivore ecosystems in Europe. Thousands of Konig ponies, heck cattle, and red deer across about 5,600 hectares. No farming, no supplemental feeding, almost no human management at all. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. We publish one every week. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the seabed itself. When the Great Closure Dike sealed off the Zuiderzee, that shallow inland sea north of Amsterdam, they drained a section called Southern Flevoland, and by 1968 they had a polder, flat, bare, wet clay that had been ocean floor a few years earlier. It was meant to become an industrial zone, factories, housing, roads, but the developers took their time, and while the land waited, something else moved in. Water pooled in the low ground and reeds took hold, and then the birds came. Gray log geese arrived in enormous numbers, tens of thousands of them, feeding through the summer. And here is the part that matters. Geese are grazers. They cropped the young reed hard, and by eating it back, they kept the reed beds open instead of letting them choke into a solid wall of stems. Open water and open reed drew still more waterfowl. The empty factory site had quietly become one of the most important wetlands in the country, and no one had planned a single acre of it. The man who answered it was Frans Vera, an ecologist working for the Dutch State Forestry Service. Vera looked at the way the geese kept the land open, and he had a thought that struck almost everyone as backwards. Most conservation of the time meant management. You mow, you cut, you spray, you hold the landscape in the shape you want. Vera argued the opposite. He believed that the old European lowlands had never been closed forest at all, but a shifting mosaic kept open by large wild grazers, the wild horses and the aurochs and the deer that had roamed the continent before people cleared them away. So his proposal was this: bring back stand-ins for those animals, put them on the polder, and then step back and let it run. Let the grazing, not the machinery, decide what the land became. The releases began in the early 1980s. First came, then, Konig Ponies, a hardy Polish horse that could live outdoors year-round without shelter or feed. Red deer were added later, wild grazers on a seabed inside a fence with no one planning to intervene. And almost as soon as the animals stepped off the transports, the objections began to gather. Because a great many people looked at Vera's plan and saw not conservation, but something they were prepared to call cruelty. Domestic breeds fenced into an enclosure with no predators and no feeding? That was the charge, and it came from every direction at once. Farmers, veterinarians, animal welfare groups, and many scientists said the same thing. These ponies and cattle would starve in hard winters, and calling mass die-off a natural process was not conservation, but cruelty. The point about the breeds was not unfair. The Konig is a Polish farm horse. The heck cattle were bred in the 1930s as none of these animals was truly wild, and they were not roaming free across a continent. They were inside a fence on a defined piece of land with a hard edge they could not cross, so the critics drew the line that mattered to them. In a real wilderness, a weak animal in a bad winter gets taken by a wolf before it starves. Here, there were no predators, and the plan was explicit: no supplemental feeding. To the people objecting, that left only one outcome. The animals would weaken through the cold months and die slowly of hunger. If behind a fence a human being had built, to them that was not nature running its course. That was a managed death dressed up as science. The fight did not stay in scientific journals. It became one of the most bitterly debated conservation projects in Europe. There were public protests. There was parliamentary scrutiny over winter mortality, questions for a piece of reclaimed farmland east of Amsterdam. That is an extraordinary amount of national attention. And yet, underneath the argument, there was a real idea. Frans Vera's case rested on something simple about how large animals shape land. Left alone, an open plain in this climate does not stay open. Grass and reed grow tall, then scrub moves in, then young trees, and within decades the whole thing closes into woodland. Large grazers stop that. They eat the grass and reed back down. They keep the land open. But the real mechanism is in the differences between them. Ponies crop tight, cattle take rougher growth, deer browse. A Konig grazes the sward close to the ground. Heck, cattle tear at the courser. Taller vegetation the ponies leave. Red deer reach up and strip the shoots off shrubs and young trees. Put those three feeding styles, you get a shifting patchwork. Close-cropped grassland here, rough marsh there, scattered thicket in between. That patchwork was the entire point. A mosaic of grassland, marsh, and thicket holds far more species than a single flat reed bed ever could. Every edge between two habitats is a place something can live. That was the biological argument for stepping back and letting it run. Not to abandon the land, to let the animals build a structure no manager could have designed. If you are finding this worth your time, a subscribe and a like genuinely help these get made. So the herds grew. Mild winters let the populations climb, year after year. And the arguments never really quieted. Every hard, cold snap brought the same questions back. But underneath all of it, quietly, the grazing was doing its work, reshaped. For years, the grazing worked in silence, and the argument never moved, until by the 1990s, the land itself began to answer, opening into grazed plains that pulled in birds no one had planned for, including one arrival that would settle the question of whether this place had truly become wild. The bird that settled it was the white-tailed eagle. By the 1990s, the polder had opened into something no one had drawn on any plan. Grazed plains stretching flat under a wide gray sky dotted with herds. The reed no longer closed over everything. Ponies had cropped it tight, cattle had taken the rougher growth, deer had browsed the edges, and between them they had made a mosaic of grassland, marsh, and thicket, and onto that open ground came the birds. Then, in 2006, a pair of white-tailed eagles built a nest at Oostvaardersplassen, and an eagle with a wingspan of well over 2 meters, hunting a landscape that engineers had once meant to pave. It nested on a drained seabed. That is the plain fact of it. The results, laid out as figures, are these. At their peak, the large grazers ran into the thousands, conic ponies, heck cattle, and red deer together on roughly 5,600 hectares. Dozens of breeding bird species were drawn in by the open mosaic, geese, waders, marsh birds, and the raptors that followed them. The reserve became, by any honest measure, one of the densest large herbivore ecosystems in Europe. Franz Vera's argument had, in the ground itself, been answered. Step back and let it run. And it ran. But the winters kept testing it, exactly as the critics had said they would. With no predators and no feeding, the herds grew. And in the winter of 2017 to 2018, the cold came and stayed. Thousands of animals died. Ponies, cattle, and deer weakened and starving on the frozen plains. The prediction that had been made decades earlier, the one about mass die-off, in part came true. There is no way to soften that, and it would be dishonest to try. So the management changed. The province moved toward reduced numbers, bringing the herds down deliberately. And in bad winters, they turned to culling and some feeding, shooting animals before they starved, and at times, putting out food. It was a partial retreat from the pure non-intervention the whole experiment had been built on. Vera's principle bent under the weight of what the public would accept and under the weight of what a hard winter actually costs. And the deeper question was never fully settled. How much should we manage land we have decided to leave alone? Those arguments are still open. The reserve holds both things at once, a genuine wild ecosystem conjured from a drained factory site and a real, unresolved cost carried through every cold season. If you have land of your own and you have ever wondered whether you could work with natural processes instead of fighting them season after season, there is a practical guide linked below on doing exactly that on your own scale. It is there if it is useful to you and easy to skip if it is not. There is a shed antler, half sunk in reclaimed clay, near a red deer carried it, then let it fall on ground that was ocean floor within living memory, on a seabed engineers once meant to pour concrete across. The tide used to move over that spot. Now an antler settles into the mud, and the herds move on past it, and the eagle watches from the reeds. That small, forgotten thing holds the whole story. The wonder of it, and the weight of it, still. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We publish one every week.